My name is Mia Chen Parker. I'm 31 years old. And last Thanksgiving, my mother-in-law served my 6-year-old son a separate meal at the family table. Fortune cookies, takeout chopsticks, and something she called Chinese chicken that smelled like it came from a can. She looked at my baby and said, "This is what kind eats." My sister-in-law laughed. Her husband smirked. Every aunt, uncle, and cousin at that table watched my son's face crumble and said nothing. I sat with my hands folded in my lap and let them believe they'd broken us. They had no idea my son was carrying a folded piece of paper in his pocket that would shatter everything they thought they controlled. Or that 6 months earlier, I'd sat in a neurologist's office with the one person at that table who'd been secretly protecting us all along. Welcome back to the final chapter, where we tell the stories of people who they were being the villain in someone else's narrative and wrote their own ending instead. If you've ever had to close a door on people who thought you'd never find the courage, this is your space. Subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going. The phone call came on a Tuesday in early November. I was at my lab reviewing data from a clinical nutrition trial when James's phone rang across the room. He was grading papers at the kitchen table. We'd developed this rhythm over 5 years of marriage. Separate work, shared space. He glanced at the screen and his face changed. That kind of pale that means the past just reached through the phone line and grabbed you by the throat. "It's my dad," he said, his voice already defensive, already protecting me from what was coming. I watched him answer, watched his shoulders tighten, watched him say "Dad" 3 times like he was trying to remember who that word belonged to. When he hung up, he just stood there holding the phone like it might ring again and take back everything that had just been said. "They want us to come home for Thanksgiving," he told me. "My father specifically asked for you and Eli. He says he has early-stage Alzheimer's and this might be his last Thanksgiving where he remembers everyone." We hadn't been to his parents' house in 5 years. Not since Eli was 6 months old, and Patricia, James's mother, held him at arm's length like he might contaminate her, and said, "Well, he certainly doesn't look like a Parker, does he?" Not since she asked me if I planned to raise him speaking Chinese, or if I'd at least try to make him American. Not since she told James at the front door that bringing me into the family was disrespectful to David's memory. David, James's older brother who died 8 years ago in a car accident in Beijing. The brother Patricia spent every holiday since then turning into a saint, whose death she blamed on that part of the world. And when James married me 3 years after David died, when he chose a Chinese-American woman to build his life with, Patricia took it as a personal betrayal of her dead son. James looked at me across our small kitchen in the home we'd built far away from all of that. "I don't want to go," he said. "I don't want them anywhere near you or Eli, but it's his dad," I said. "And if Robert really is losing his memory, James will regret not going. I know my husband. He carries guilt like other people carry car keys, always within reach, always weighing down his pockets. So I told him we'd go, just for the day, just for dinner. We could handle one dinner." What I didn't tell James was that Robert's call wasn't a surprise to me. Because 6 months earlier, I'd sat across from his father in a coffee shop 40 minutes from our house, and Robert had told me he was scared, not of dying, not of forgetting, but of what Patricia would do with his illness if she was the one controlling the story. That meeting started with a text message I almost deleted. Robert had never contacted me directly. Every birthday card for Eli came addressed to James with just his name on the envelope like I didn't exist. But this text was different. "Mia, I need your help with something medical. Can we meet? Don't tell James yet. I'm not ready to worry him." I stared at that message for 20 minutes before I responded. We met on a Thursday morning when James was teaching and Eli was at school. Robert looked smaller than I remembered. Older. His hands shook slightly when he lifted his coffee cup. He told me he'd been diagnosed 3 months earlier. Early-stage Alzheimer's. Mild cognitive impairment that would progress. His neurologist had recommended immediate intervention, possible clinical trials, aggressive treatment plans. But Patricia wouldn't hear it. She'd thrown away the doctor's referral papers, told him to pray harder, refused to let him tell their children. She said if he didn't talk about it, if he didn't make a fuss, it would just go away. But Robert knew better. He'd been forgetting things. Small things at first. Where he put his keys, what day it was, then bigger things. Conversations, promises. He woke up some mornings not sure what year it was. He asked me for help, because I'm a food scientist. Because I work adjacent to medical research. Because I have connections to clinical trials and experimental treatments. Because he knew I'd understand the science and Patricia wouldn't. But mostly, he asked me because he said I was the only person in his family who'd ever looked at him like he still had the right to make his own choices. I asked him why he didn't go to James first. He said because James would tell Patricia out of some sense of family loyalty. Because James still believes his mother can change. And because Robert needed someone who understood what it felt like to be erased while you're still breathing. So, I helped him. I researched trials. I found a program at a university hospital 2 hours away that was testing a combination therapy for early intervention. I helped him apply. I went with him to appointments when Patricia thought he was at the hardware store. I sat with him while he signed consent forms and intake paperwork. And then I helped him with the other documents. The ones that really mattered. Healthcare proxy, durable power of attorney, medical trust, living will. Every single legal protection that would prevent Patricia from controlling his care or accessing his assets once she realized she was losing control of him. I am his designated healthcare agent. I am his power of attorney. And every document is notarized, witnessed, filed, and completely beyond Patricia's reach. Robert made me promise not to tell James until the right time. He said his son needed to believe in family a little longer. Needed to hope that Patricia might soften, that Rachel might grow a spine, that Thanksgiving dinner might be the moment everyone finally acted like adults. I promised, and I waited, and when Robert called in November and asked us to come home, I knew exactly what he meant. It was time. The drive to the Parker house took 3 hours. Eli sat in the back seat with his tablet and his favorite stuffed dinosaur, completely unaware that we were driving toward people who'd spent 5 years pretending he didn't exist. He was excited. He'd never really met his grandparents. He knew Nana and Pop, my parents who video called every Sunday and sent care packages full of books and drawings, and notes in Chinese characters that I translated for him at bedtime. But James's parents were these mythical figures he'd only seen in photos. Grandma Patricia and Grandpa Robert, who lived far away and were very busy. James's hands were white on the steering wheel. Every few miles he'd glance at me like he was about to suggest we turn around. I'd reach over and touch his knee and he'd take a breath and keep driving. Eli asked why we'd never been to Grandma's house before. James said Grandma and Daddy had a disagreement a long time ago. Eli asked what about. James said sometimes grown-ups don't agree on important things and they need time apart. Eli asked if they agreed now. James said he hoped so. I said nothing. I just watched the trass and I thought the recipe card folded in Eli's jacket pocket. The one I'd given him that morning with very specific instructions about when to take it out. We pulled up to the house just after noon. It was exactly as I remembered. Large colonial with perfect landscaping. American flag on the porch. Seasonal wreath on the door. Everything about the house screamed, "We belong here and you don't." Patricia answered the door before we even knocked. She was wearing an apron that said blessed and thankful in script font. Her smile was tight. "James," she said, "and Mia, and this must be Eli, not my grandson, not the child I haven't seen in 5 years, just Eli." Like he was a neighbor's kid we'd brought along. Eli looked up at her with his huge brown eyes and said, "Hi, Grandma," and held out the card he'd made in art class. It had a turkey on it and said, "Happy Thanksgiving" in crayon. Patricia took it the way you'd take a flyer from someone on the street. "Oh, how nice," she said. Then she turned and walked back into the house without inviting us in. We followed because what else do you do? The house smelled like turkey, and something floral, and underneath it all, something stale like air that hasn't moved in years. Rachel was in the living room with her husband, Kevin. Rachel hugged James for a long time and said, "Oh my God, it's been forever." She looked at me and said, "Hey Mia, good to see you," in a voice that meant the opposite. She didn't bend down to say hello to Eli. Kevin didn't stand up from the couch. He just raised his beer and said, "Parker, good to see you, man." Robert was in his armchair by the window. When he saw me, his whole face changed. Relief, fear, determination. He stood up carefully and crossed to Eli and knelt down with some effort and said, "Hello, young man. I'm your grandpa Robert." Eli shook his hand very seriously. Robert's eyes were wet. He looked at me over Eli's head and I gave him the smallest nod. "We're here. We're ready. Let's do this." The living room was a shrine to David. Photos everywhere. High school graduation. College acceptance letter framed on the wall. His baseball trophies on the shelf. His varsity jacket hung on a hook by the stairs. And in the center of the mantel, a large portrait of David in a suit, smiling, frozen at 24. The last photo taken before he left for his backpacking trip through Asia. Below the portrait, a small plaque. David Michael Parker, beloved son and brother, gone too soon. Eli noticed immediately that there were no pictures of him. No photos of James's wedding. No baby pictures. No evidence that James had a life after David died. He whispered to me, "Mama, how come Grandma doesn't have any pictures of us?" I said, "Sometimes people will have trouble making room for new memories. They're still sad about old ones." He thought about that. Then he said, "That's really sad for Grandma." And I thought, yes, baby, yes it is. Patricia directed us to the dining room, where the table was set for Thanksgiving. 8 places, adults only, crystal glasses, china plates, cloth napkins. And in the corner of the room, a small card table with 1 plastic plate, 1 small cup, 1 paper napkin. Patricia saw me looking at it. "I thought Eli would be more comfortable at his own table," she said. "He's 6, I said. "He eats with us at home." Patricia smiled that smile. "I'm sure he does. But this way he won't feel pressured to keep up with adult conversation." James opened his mouth. I touched his arm. "Not yet, wait. If you're watching this and you recognize this moment, if you've ever sat at a table where someone made your child feel less than, this story is for you. Subscribe to the final chapter right now, because what happens next is going to validate every boundary you've ever set. And leave a comment telling me where you're from, because I want to know our community is growing across every border they tried to build." Dinner preparation was a performance. Patricia in the kitchen, directing Rachel like a stage manager. "Stir this. Check that. Set these out." I offered to help. Patricia looked at me like I'd suggested burning the house down. "Oh, that's not necessary, Mia. I'm sure you're used to very different cooking methods. We'll handle the traditional meal." Rachel giggled. Kevin wandered in and grabbed another beer. James helped his dad carry chairs from the garage. The extra chairs. The ones that didn't match the set. For people who weren't quite family but you had to include them anyway. Eli sat on the floor with his coloring book, drawing turkeys and pilgrims, completely unaware that every adult in this house, except one, had already decided he didn't belong. I sat on the couch and folded my hands in my lap and watched Patricia orchestrate. She was in her element. Thanksgiving was her stage, her holiday, her chance to show everyone what a real American family looked like. And we were the wrong-shaped pieces she was about to force into her perfect puzzle. Robert caught my eye from across the room. Kevin was hovering near him with a briefcase. I'd noticed it when we arrived. Expensive leather. Out of place at a family dinner. Kevin kept touching it like he was making sure it was still there. Robert shook his head slightly when he saw me watching. "Not yet," he mouthed. After dinner, I nodded. I knew what was in that briefcase. Robert had warned me. Power of attorney documents, healthcare proxy forms, guardianship papers, nursing home brochures. Kevin had been working on this for months, ever since Patricia had let it slip to Rachel that Robert's memory was going. They saw an opportunity. Control his medical decisions, access his veteran's pension, move him into a facility where he couldn't object, classic elder financial abuse. And they thought today, surrounded by family, Robert would be too overwhelmed to refuse. They had no idea every single one of those documents was already obsolete. That 6 months ago, Robert had already signed everything that mattered with me as his agent. That his care plan was established and locked. That his assets were protected in a trust they couldn't touch. We just had to get through dinner first. We just had to let them show everyone exactly who they were. And then we'd show them what we'd built in secret. Patricia announced dinner. Everyone moved to the table. Kevin sat at one end, Robert at the other. Patricia next to Kevin. Rachel next to her mother. James next to his father and me. They seated me between James and the wall, boxed in. Eli stayed at his card table in the corner. He looked so small over there, so alone. He picked up his paper napkin and tried to fold it the way I'd taught him, to fold cloth napkins at home. Tried to make his little table look fancy like the big table, and my heart cracked right down the middle. Patricia said grace, thanked God for family, for tradition, for the blessing of having everyone together. She said we remember those who can't be with us. And she looked at David's portrait. She did not mention Eli. When she said amen, Kevin immediately started carving the turkey. Patricia directed the passing of dishes. Green bean casserole to the left, mashed potatoes to the right, cranberry sauce, stuffing, gravy. Every plate was filled generously. Every adult had a feast in front of them. And then Patricia stood up. She smiled that smile again. Now for our special guest, she said. She disappeared into the kitchen. My stomach dropped. James reached for my hand under the table. Robert's jaw tightened. Patricia returned carrying a plate. She walked to Eli's card table in the corner. She set the plate down in front of my son with a flourish. There you go, sweetheart, something you'd be more comfortable with. On the plate was fried rice. The kind from a box that you add water to. Sweet and sour chicken from a can, I could smell the corn syrup and red dye. A handful of those crispy noodles from a bag. 2 fortune cookies. And a pair of wooden takeout chopsticks, the kind that give you splinters. Eli stared at it. He looked at the turkey on everyone else's plates. He looked at the plate in front of him. He looked at me. Mama, he said, his voice so small. Why is my plate different? Patricia answered before I could. Because your heritage is different, sweetheart. We wanted to honor that. We made you something from your culture. Rachel actually laughed out loud. That's so thoughtful, Mom. Kevin raised his beer. Cultural sensitivity right there. Robert's hands were shaking. James started to push his chair back. I grabbed his wrist hard. Not yet. Eli's eyes filled with tears. But I wanted turkey like everyone else, he said. His voice breaking on the word everyone. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Heavy enough to crush a child. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The relatives around the table looked at their plates, looked at the wall, looked anywhere except at the 6-year-old boy in the corner whose grandmother had just told him he wasn't American enough for turkey. Patricia sat down and picked up her fork. Well, she said brightly, let's eat. Eli didn't touch his food. He just sat there with his hands in his lap, tears running down his cheeks, trying not to make noise, because even at 6 he'd already learned that crying made things worse. I stayed in my seat, hands folded, face calm. I looked at Robert. He was staring at Eli with an expression I'd never seen before. Horror, shame, grief, rage, all of it moving across his face like weather. And then something else, decision. I watched my son wipe his eyes with his paper napkin, watched him reach into his jacket pocket, watched him pull out the folded piece of paper I'd given him that morning. The recipe card. He stood up from his little table, walked across the dining room, walked right up to Patricia at the head of the table. His voice was steady, even though his face was wet. Grandma, he said, Mommy told me to give you this. She said you lost yours and you might want it back. He held out the folded card. Patricia looked confused. She took it, unfolded it, and I watched the color drain from her face. It was a recipe card. Old, stained, the paper soft from being folded and refolded. Written in blue pen in handwriting Patricia would know anywhere. David's handwriting. Recipe for jiaozi, it said at the top. Chinese dumplings. And below that, in David's familiar scrawl. Learned this from a grandmother outside the hostel in Beijing. She didn't speak English, I didn't speak Mandarin. But somehow we understood each other. She taught me to fold the dough and seal the edges. We ate them right there on the street, and they were the best thing I ever tasted. Can't wait to make these with Dad when I get home. This is what food is supposed to be. Something that brings people together, no matter where they're from. Patricia dropped the card on the table like it burned her. Where did you get this? She said. Her voice shaking. I answered. I saved it. 7 years ago. You threw it away and I pulled it out of the trash. Robert reached across the table and picked up the card. He read it, his hands trembling, his eyes filling. Oh, David, he said. Oh, my boy. James leaned over to see, stared at his brother's handwriting, touched the paper like it might disappear. How long have you had this? He asked me. Since the first time I came to this house, I said. Since the day Patricia was throwing out everything David sent home from his trip, every postcard, every photo, every recipe. Because she couldn't stand to remember that David loved it over there. That he was happy. that he was learning and growing and falling in love with a part of the world she wanted to blame for his death. Patricia stood up. Her chair scraped loud. "How dare you," she said. "How dare you bring that into my house?" Robert stood up too, slower, harder. He was still holding the card. "Sit down, Patricia," he said. She sat. Because there was something in his voice she hadn't heard in 8 years. Authority. Finality. The voice of a man who'd made a decision and was done being argued with. Robert looked at the plate in front of Eli, at the cheap fried rice and the canned chicken and the fortune cookies. He looked at his grandson's face, still wet with tears, and then he looked at his wife. "You just humiliated a child," he said quietly. "You made a meal specifically designed to tell your grandson he doesn't belong in his own family because his mother is Chinese American. You did this deliberately. On Thanksgiving, at a table where we're supposed to be grateful for the people we love. And you did it in front of everyone here, so they'd know that this is acceptable in this house. That this is what we do to children who don't look the way you think they should look." Patricia opened her mouth. Robert held up his hand. "I'm not finished." He turned to Rachel. "You laughed. You sat there and laughed when your mother humiliated your nephew." He turned to Kevin. "And you called it cultural sensitivity. Like performing racism with takeout chopsticks is some kind of progressive act." He looked at the rest of the relatives around the table. "And not one of you said a word. You just ate your turkey and looked at your plates and let it happen because it was easier than speaking up. Because Patricia runs this family. And you all know what happens when you cross her." Kevin cleared his throat. "Bob, I think you're overreacting. This is a family dinner and emotions are high. Maybe we should talk about those documents I brought. Get your affairs in order while we're all here." He reached for the briefcase beside his chair, pulled out a folder. "These are just some routine papers. Healthcare proxy, power of attorney. Nothing complicated. Just some protections in case your condition progresses. We found a great memory care facility about an hour from here. Rachel and I can help manage things so you don't have to worry." Robert stared at the folder. Kevin spread the papers on the table. Official looking. Multiple pages. Signature lines highlighted. Patricia was nodding. "It's for the best, Robert. You can't keep living alone with your condition. You need professional care." Rachel added, "We've already toured the facility, Dad. It's really nice. You'd be safe there." Kevin pushed the papers closer to Robert. "Just sign here and here, Bob. We can start the intake process next week. Get you moved in after the holidays. Make this easier on everyone." Robert looked at the papers for a long moment. Then he looked at me. I stood up. Kevin glanced at me like he'd forgotten I was even there. "Mia, this is family business. Robert can't sign those documents," I said. My voice level. Professional. The voice I use when I'm presenting research findings. Clinical. Precise. Kevin looked annoyed. "Mia, I know you mean well, but this is between Robert and his children." I repeated, "He can't sign those documents." Kevin put his pen down. "Why not?" "Because they're invalid," I said. "Every piece of paper in that folder is worthless." The room went very still. Rachel looked at her mother. Patricia stared at me. Kevin said, "What are you talking about?" I took a breath. Robert's healthcare proxy was established 6 months ago. His durable power of attorney was notarized and witnessed in May. His medical trust and advanced care directives are on file with his neurologist, his primary care physician, and his attorney of record. Every document that governs Robert's healthcare decisions, his financial accounts, his property, and his end-of-life care has already been legally executed and recorded. Patricia found her voice. "What attorney? What are you talking about?" Robert spoke. "Mia is my attorney, in fact. She is my designated healthcare proxy. She is my power of attorney for both financial and medical decisions. And 6 months ago, she helped me enroll in a clinical trial for early-stage Alzheimer's treatment at a university hospital 2 hours from here. A trial you, Patricia, actively tried to prevent me from participating in when you threw away my neurologist's referrals and told me to handle my diagnosis with prayer instead of medicine." Kevin was staring at the papers in his hand like they'd betrayed him. "This doesn't make sense. When did you?" How did, I answered. "We've been working together since May. Every Tuesday when Patricia thought Robert was at the hardware store, he was actually at medical appointments, intake evaluations, clinical trial enrollment, legal consultations. We established a comprehensive healthcare plan that includes experimental treatment protocols, cognitive behavioral therapy, and long-term care arrangements that respect Robert's wishes, not yours. And that nursing facility you chose, I continued, the one you've already toured, it has 3 formal complaints filed with the state for elder abuse, substandard care, financial exploitation of residents, understaffing that resulted in patient injuries. I have the public records. I've reviewed them. That facility will never have access to Robert. Rachel's face went red. You can't just swoop in and take over his life. I'm his daughter. I'm his healthcare proxy, I said again. He chose me. He signed the legal documents of his own free will while fully competent. And those documents supersede any relationship you think gives you authority. Kevin tried one more time. Bob, you don't have to do this. These are your kids. We're trying to help. Robert's voice was tired but firm. You're trying to access my veteran's pension. You're trying to move me into a facility where I can't make my own decisions so you can control my assets. I'm not signing anything, Kevin. And the papers you brought are meaningless because everything that matters is already decided. Patricia slammed her hand on the table. This is her doing. She's manipulated you. She's turned you against your own family. Robert looked at his wife, the woman he'd been married to for 40 years. Really looked at her. You did that, Patricia. You turned this family against itself when David died. You took your grief and you weaponized it. You pushed away our son because he fell in love with a woman whose heritage you blame for a car accident that had nothing to do with her. You've spent 5 years pretending your grandson doesn't exist because he's half Chinese. And you just served him a plate of racist garbage at a table where he should have been welcomed and loved. You did this, and I let you. And I will spend whatever time I have left making that right. He walked over to Eli's card table, knelt down with effort, his knees creaking, took both of Eli's small hands in his. I'm so sorry, sweetheart. That meal your grandmother made was mean. It was wrong. She was trying to hurt you and your mama, and I should have stopped it the second she brought it out. I should have stopped all of this years ago. Eli looked at him with those huge brown eyes. Why doesn't Grandma like me? Robert's voice cracked. Because Grandma is stuck being angry at the wrong things, and she can't see the beautiful person right in front of her. But that's her problem, not yours. You are perfect exactly as you are. He stood up, turned to James. Get your son's coat, we're leaving. Patricia actually gasped. You can't just walk out of Thanksgiving dinner. Robert looked at her. Watch me. James was already moving, getting coats from the front closet. I picked up the recipe card from the table, folded it carefully, put it in my pocket. Robert addressed the room one last time. I enabled this. I sat in that chair for 8 years and watched Patricia turn her grief into cruelty. I watched her push away our son and grandson because I didn't want to rock the boat. Because I thought keeping peace was the same as keeping family. I was wrong. And I'm done. Kevin made one last attempt. Bob, think about what you're doing. You need family right now. You need support. Robert turned to him. I need people who treat my grandson like a human being. That disqualifies everyone in this room except Mia and James. He looked at Patricia. David loved Beijing. He loved the food and the people and the experience. He wrote me letters about how traveling opened his heart. How different cultures taught him that the world was bigger and more beautiful than he'd imagined. You took those letters and burned them. Because they didn't fit the story you needed to tell yourself about his death. You erased the person he actually was so you could turn him into a symbol of your own fear and hatred. And you did the same thing to Eli before you even met him. He turned to me. Thank you for saving my son's recipe, and thank you for saving me. He picked up the fortune cookie from Eli's plate, cracked it open. Read the little paper inside. Your happiness is within your control. He smiled sadly. Took me 8 years to figure that out. James had Eli's coat on. My coat on. He was holding our bag. Robert walked to the front door, opened it. Cold November air rushed in. He looked back once at the perfect dining room with its perfect table and its perfect meal, and the woman he'd spent 4 decades with. Then he walked out. We followed. In the car, Eli sat in the back next to Robert. He was quiet for a while, and then he said, Grandpa, are you going to be okay? Robert reached over and squeezed his hand. I am now, kiddo. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. James was crying as he drove, quiet tears running down his face. He reached over and took my hand. How long have you known? He asked. 6 months, I said. Why didn't you tell me? Because your dad asked me not to. Because he needed to know he could make his own choices before he had to fight everyone else about them. Because sometimes love means keeping a secret until it's time for the truth to matter. We didn't go home that night. We got a hotel room with 2 double beds. Robert took one. Eli insisted on sleeping in Grandpa's bed so he wouldn't be lonely. James and I lay awake in the other bed holding hands in the dark. He said, I can't believe we're never going back there. I said, I can't believe we ever did. He said, what happens now? I said, now we build something better. Now we show Eli what family actually looks like. Now we let your dad spend whatever time he has left being treated with dignity instead of controlled by fear. In the morning, Robert was already awake. Eli was showing him something on his tablet. A video about dinosaurs. Robert was asking questions, and Eli was explaining very seriously about herbivores and carnivores and the Cretaceous period. James made coffee in the little hotel pot. We sat around the small table and ate continental breakfast, and Robert said, I'd like to come home with you. If there's room. James started crying again. There's always been room, Dad. There's always been room. If this story is resonating with you, if you've ever had to choose between keeping peace and keeping your child safe, subscribe to the final chapter right now. Because the ending is going to show you what happens when you finally choose yourself. And comment below telling me your story, because I read every single one, and you are not alone in this. Robert moved into our guest room the week after Thanksgiving. We converted it into a proper bedroom, comfortable chair, good reading light, photos on the dresser of all of us, David as a boy, James and David together, James and me on our wedding day, Eli at every age, the family that existed and the family that was growing, and on the wall, framed under glass, David's recipe card. The one Patricia threw away, the one I saved, the jiaozi recipe with David's handwriting, and his notes about the grandmother in Beijing, and the reminder that food brings people together. Robert's clinical trial was showing promise. The combination therapy was slowing his cognitive decline. He still forgot things, small things, where he put his reading glasses, what day of the week it was. But he remembered the important things. He remembered us. He remembered David. He remembered why he left. And we made sure that everything he wanted to remember was documented before it could slip away. We started a project, Robert and Eli and me. We called it David's Recipe Book. Robert would remember a dish David had sent home, a recipe from his travels, something he'd talked about wanting to cook, and we'd recreate it. We'd cook it together, take photos, write down the stories Robert remembered. The time David made paella from scratch after a summer in Spain, the curry he'd learned in Thailand, the pierogi he'd made after visiting Poland. Every dish was a memory. Every memory was a way of keeping David alive as the person he actually was. Open, curious, someone who loved the world instead of feared it. Eli learned to make jiaozi. Robert taught him the way David had described in his notes. How to hold the dough, how to seal the edges so the filling didn't leak, how to know when they were perfectly cooked. On Saturday mornings, they'd stand at our kitchen counter with flour on their hands and steam rising from the pot, and Robert would tell stories about David. Real stories. Not the sanitized St. Patricia had created. He told Eli about David's terrible jokes, his fear of spiders, the time he got lost in Rome and accidentally ended up at a dinner party with a family who didn't speak English but fed him anyway. How he'd come home from every trip a little more himself, a little more certain that the world was good and people were kind and difference was something to celebrate, not fear. Patricia called twice in those first months. The first call was 2 weeks after Thanksgiving. James answered because he couldn't help himself. She told him he'd made a terrible mistake, that I'd manipulated his father, that Robert needed to come home where he belonged, that this was destroying the family. James listened for a while and then he said, Mom, you destroyed the family when you made my son cry because of what he looks like. You destroyed it when you threw away David's letters because they didn't match your anger. You destroyed it every time you chose your own comfort over basic human decency. I didn't leave. You pushed us out. And Dad finally had the courage to walk away from that. She hung up. The second call was in January. Rachel this time. James let it go to voicemail. We listened to it together. She said they were having financial problems. Kevin's business wasn't doing well. They'd counted on Robert's pension to help with their mortgage. Could James maybe talk to his dad about releasing some funds? Could Mia reverse whatever legal witchcraft she'd pulled? They just needed a little help. Family helps family, right? James deleted the message. He didn't call back. Robert's pension went into his medical trust every month. It paid for his treatment, his medications, his share of household expenses. It was his money, for his care, not for Rachel's mortgage, not for Kevin's failed business ventures. When Robert found out about the call, he said, "Good. Let them figure it out the way everyone else figures it out, without taking advantage of someone who's vulnerable." The extended family divided the way families always do, after someone finally tells the truth out loud. Some relatives reached out to James quietly. His cousin Mike sent a text saying he'd wanted to say something at dinner, but didn't know how. His Aunt Sarah called to say she was ashamed she'd stayed silent. They'd seen what Patricia was doing for years, but nobody wanted to be the one to challenge her. A few others sent cards to Robert at our address. "Get well soon. We're thinking of you." Carefully worded messages that didn't take sides but acknowledged he existed outside Patricia's house. And then there were the ones who circled around Patricia. Her sister Margaret, who called James a traitor. Patricia's book club friends, who posted on social media about the importance of honoring your parents. The cousins who'd always benefited from being on Patricia's good side and weren't about to lose that status now. By February, most people had chosen their camp, and the ones who really mattered, the ones who'd watched a 6-year-old boy be humiliated at a holiday table and done nothing, didn't matter anymore. Robert said something to me one Saturday morning while we were making dumplings with Eli. He said, "You know what I realized? The people who are mad at me for leaving aren't mad that I left Patricia. They're mad that I made them look at their own choices. Because if I can walk away after 40 years, what's their excuse for staying silent when they see something wrong?" I didn't answer. I just folded another dumpling and thought about all the years I'd spent trying to make myself smaller so Patricia's discomfort wouldn't be so loud. About how much energy I'd wasted trying to prove I deserved basic respect. About how none of that had ever mattered because some people are determined to make you the villain in their story no matter what you do. Robert started writing letters. Not to Patricia. Not to Rachel, but to Eli. Letters that Eli was too young to read but that we saved in a box under Robert's bed. Letters about David. About James as a boy. About Robert's own father. And the things he wished he'd said before it was too late. About regret and redemption and what it means to be a man who protects the people he loves instead of the people he fears. He wrote one every week. Sometimes more. He'd sit at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside him and fill page after page with his careful handwriting. Getting it all down before his memory took it away. Building a record of who he'd been and who he was becoming. Leaving Eli a grandfather in words since he might not have him in person for as long as either of them wanted. James struggled more than I expected. He'd cut his mother off before. He'd built a life separate from her. But having his father with us every day was a constant reminder of everything his family could have been if Patricia had chosen differently. He'd watch Robert and Eli together, and I'd see it on his face. Grief for the grandfather Eli should have had from birth. Anger at the years that were stolen. Guilt that he hadn't fought harder sooner. I told him one night when we were alone that you can't fight someone else's mental illness. That Patricia's grief had calcified into something toxic, and no amount of reasoning or pleading or proving would have changed that. That he did the right thing by protecting Eli. That cutting off contact was an act of love, not failure, he cried. He said he just wanted a normal family. I said we have one now. It just doesn't include the people we thought it would. In March, we celebrated Eli's 7th birthday. My parents drove up from Virginia. Robert was there, of course. James's best friend from college came with his wife and kids. We had cake and presents and too much noise, and Robert sat in the living room, watching it all with this expression of complete peace. Afterward, when everyone had gone home and Eli was asleep, Robert said, "Thank you for giving me this. Thank you for letting me be here. I said your family. This is where you belong." He shook his head. "I haven't belonged anywhere in a very long time. Patricia made sure of that. But you gave me a place anyway. You gave me a second chance to get it right. and I'm going to spend every day I have left making sure Eli knows he was always worth fighting for. By spring, Robert's condition had progressed slightly. His short-term memory was weaker. He'd forget what we'd talked about that morning. He'd ask the same question twice. But the important things stayed solid. He knew us. He knew why he was there. He knew that Patricia had been wrong and he'd made the right choice by leaving. His neurologist said the trial was working better than expected, that Robert's cognitive decline was significantly slower than the standard progression model, that the combination of medication, therapy, and what the doctor called psychosocial support was keeping him stable. I didn't tell the doctor that psychosocial support meant making dumplings with his grandson and telling stories about his dead son, and finally living in a house where he didn't have to perform grief to earn his place. David's recipe book was nearly finished. 43 recipes, 43 stories, 43 memories of the son Patricia had tried to turn into a symbol, and we'd tried to recover as a person. Robert wrote introductions for each one, where David had learned it, why it mattered, what it taught him about his son. The book wasn't just recipes. It was a record of who David really was. Someone who saw food as connection, who believed different cultures made the world richer, not dangerous, who died doing what he loved in a place that had brought him joy. Not a cautionary tale about the dangers of leaving home. Just a young man who'd lived fully and died too soon and deserved to be remembered as himself, not as his mother's grief made flesh. We printed copies, one for Eli, one for James, one for Robert's room. I asked Robert if he wanted to send one to Patricia. He thought about it for a long time. Then he said no. She had her chance to know David. She chose to remake him into something he wasn't. I'm not giving her another chance to do that to his memory. This book is for the people who loved him as he was. She doesn't get to be in that group anymore. So we kept it for ourselves. And every time we made one of David's recipes, we read his story. And Robert would add details he'd just remembered. And Eli would ask questions. And slowly, carefully, we built a version of David that was true. Messy and full of joy and complicated and real. Summer came. Eli finished first grade. Robert came to his end-of-year performance, where Eli played a tree in a play about the rainforest. Robert clapped louder than anyone. We took a week and drove to the beach. Rented a house with a porch. Robert sat in a chair with a book he mostly didn't read, just watched Eli play in the sand, and James surf and me walk the shoreline collecting shells. One evening on that porch, Robert said, "This is what it should have been. All of it. All those years. If I'd been braver sooner. If I'd told Patricia no when she first started rewriting history. If I'd protected James the way you protect Eli. This is what we could have had." I said, "You have it now." He said yes, and I'm grateful. But I'm also sorry for all the time we lost. Patricia sent a letter in August. Not to Robert. To James. It came to our house in a cream-colored envelope with her perfect handwriting. James held it for 3 days before he opened it. When he finally did, he read it twice and then handed it to me without a word. It was 2 pages. She said she'd been thinking that maybe she'd been too harsh. That family was important, and she missed her son. That the holidays were coming, and it would be nice if they could try again. She said she understood they were a package deal now, Mia and Eli included, and she was willing to accept that. She didn't apologize. Not once. Not for the separate meal. Not for the racism. Not for 5 years of pretending Eli didn't exist. She just said she was willing to accept us. Like it was a generous concession. Like we should be grateful she was offering to tolerate our presence in her home. James asked what I thought. I said it's not about what I think. It's about what you need. He said he needed to know if I'd be okay if he wanted to try. If he wanted to see if she'd really changed. I said I'd be okay, but Eli wouldn't be in a room with her unless I saw real change first. Not performative acceptance. Real acknowledgement of harm. Real apology. Real change behavior over time. Not one letter promising to tolerate us. I wouldn't risk Eli being humiliated again, because his father hoped his mother might suddenly develop empathy. James nodded. He wrote back. He said he'd be willing to meet her alone for coffee to talk. But Robert and Eli and I were not available for trial runs of her redemption. If she wanted a relationship with her family, she needed to do the work to earn that. Not demand we give her chances she hadn't earned, because blood supposedly meant something more than behavior. She never responded to that letter. And James finally accepted what I'd known for years. Patricia didn't want a relationship with her son. She wanted an audience for her version of events. She wanted people at her table who wouldn't challenge her story. And when she couldn't have that, she'd rather have nothing. So that's what she got. Nothing. And James grieved. Not for the mother she'd never been, but for the mother he'd kept hoping she'd become. And then he let it go. And we moved forward. Robert's birthday was in October. He turned 73. We made all of David's recipes. 43 dishes spread across our kitchen and dining room. It took us 3 days, Robert and Eli and me cooking together. James helping where he could. My parents came up again. James's friend Mike and his family. Our neighbors who'd watched Robert become part of our household and never asked intrusive questions. We had a feast. Not a perfect Thanksgiving table with assigned seats and hierarchies. Just people who cared about each other eating food that meant something and telling stories and laughing. Robert gave a speech. He said a year ago he'd been sitting in a house where he felt invisible, where his illness was something to hide, and his memories were something to erase, and his grandson was something to pretend didn't exist. And now he was here, in a home where he mattered, where his stories were documented, where his grandson called him grandpa and meant it. He said he didn't know how much time he had left, but he knew every single day of it would be spent somewhere he was loved as he was, not as someone needed him to be. And that was more than most people got. So he was grateful. Eli gave him a present. A drawing. Robert and Eli and David at the lake. Robert had told him the story, so many times Eli could picture it. The green tackle box, the gold water. The 3 of them fishing together, even though Eli had never met David, and David never knew Eli existed. In the picture they were all smiling, all together, holding fishing poles and sitting on a dock that existed in memory and imagination and love. Robert cried when he saw it. He hung it on his wall next to David's recipe card. 2 pieces of paper that contained whole histories. Proof that people could be gone and still present. That family could be chosen and still real. That sometimes the stories we tell matter more than the blood we share. That's our story. 1 humiliating meal. 1 recipe card. 1 grandfather who finally chose love over fear. 1 father who learned that protecting his child meant disappointing his mother. 1 mother who learned that some battles are won by walking away. And 1 little boy who learned that his worth was never up for debate. That he belonged exactly as he was. That the right people would see him, and the wrong people didn't matter. If this reached you tonight, if you've ever been the wrong shape for someone else's family, subscribe to the final chapter because your story isn't over. It's just starting to be written by the right author. You. And comment where you're watching from, because I will love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going. We're building something here. A community of people who decided they were done being edited out of their own lives. And you're part of that now. Welcome home.